Fairy-type Pokémon have been a source of great debate since their introduction as the 18th type in Generation 6. While many have welcomed Fairy-type's inclusion, many others have pushed back against them, claiming that they were unneeded, unbalanced, and worst of all, girly. So in this video, let's go over why the Fairy-type had to happen, how it's affected the game since then, and how the type has grown and evolved over time. But as magical as Fairy-type Pokémon are, they certainly don't compare to the magic offered by today's sponsor, Vessi. If you haven't heard of Vessi before, they make some of the craziest comfortable shoes that I have ever worn. They call these things cloud comfortable, and I believe it. It's like walking on an air mattress. But the real magic is how they fit into any type of weather or social activity. They're kinda casual, but they're kinda dressy at the same time. Hey, that rhymes with Vessi, what are the odds? So whether I'm going to my favorite coffee shop, taking a morning stroll, grilling out with my dad, or really doing anything else, my Vessis are perfect for the occasion. They're even waterproof and keep your feet in a nice climate-controlled environment wherever you go. That's right, no more sweaty or frozen feet. My feet have been so comfortable since switching over to these babies. And if that's not enough, they come in all sorts of cool colors. There's no shortage of options. And right now, you can use my link vessi.com/JPR to get 15% off your first pair. So say hello to your new favorite daily sneaker and be sure to use my link. You'll be helping support the channel while also helping support your feet and your fashion at the same time. Thank you, Vessi, for sponsoring. Let's get back to the video. Back in 2013, during the news cycle for Pokemon X and Y, interviews with the staff pretty much all cited the dominance of Dragon-type Pokemon in Gen 5 as the primary motivator for creating the Fairy-type. Many Dragon-type fans pushed back against this narrative, though, believing that dragons have never really been as broken as some people claimed. But assuming you didn't watch my several-year-old Dragon-type history video, let's go over some of the specifics. Dragon was always envisioned as a very exclusive type. And in the first two generations, only two fully evolved Dragon types existed. In Gens 3 and 4, they branched out a little bit, making the type have slightly more of a presence, but still trying to keep their numbers relatively low. However, in Gen 5, Dragon-type Pokemon were becoming as common as many other types. In fact, did you know that as of 2025, there are as many Dragon-type Pokemon as Electric-type Pokemon? That's kind of a crazy stat. But yeah, aside from their increasing numbers, tools like Draco Meteor, Dragon Dance, and the new item Dragon Gem were all making a big splash in the meta, both in singles and VGC. In Gen 5 singles, dragons dominated the top tier of play, with 8 different dragons all occupying the OU tier. And a Dragon-type Pokemon had won the World Championships every year from 2009 to 2013. With 2012 being the most noteworthy example of their dominance, when Ray Rizzo took both Garchomp and Hydreigon to the finals. See, while Dragon doesn't outright beat any types other than itself, it also wasn't resisted by anything other than Steel. This means there really isn't anything to stop them from setting up with Dragon Dance and sweeping with Outrage, or dropping what was essentially a Beta Z move in the form of Dragon Gem boosted Draco Meteor. Aside from Psychic or Normal in Gen 1, no other type has ever had the unmatched offensive prowess that Dragon did in Gen 5. And you know what happened to Gen 1 Psychic and Normal? They got nerfed by new types in Gen 2. Time is truly a flat circle. But to pin everything on Dragon types is a little bit of an overgeneralization. In fact, Fighting-type Pokemon were also beginning to become a little bit offensively unbalanced. Fighting-type Pokemon already on average have the highest attack stats in the game, and after the addition of Close Combat in Gen 4, they were on the rise pretty fast. All it took was the addition of 3 meta-defining Pokemon, Terrakion, Scrafty, and Conkeldurr in Gen 5 for things to go code red. Conkeldurr in particular won 2 of the 3 World Championships held in the Black and White era, and in 2013, it was represented on every trainer's team in the top 3. This Pokemon could hit insanely hard with sheer force, and almost nothing could resist its wide move pool. While individual threats like Cresselia, Thundurus, and Tyranitar still outranked the usage of Fighting and Dragon types, it was clear that the meta was favoring a few types a bit too heavily. And so, the Fairy type was born, limiting the overpowering offensive freedom that Dragon and Fighting types had come to know during Gen 5. And oh boy did they come out swinging! A Box Legendary, a new Eevee evolution, a Gym Leader, oh, and 37 new Fairy types I might add. This is probably the most ridiculous stat, and it's why I can understand why reception to fairies at first was kinda lukewarm. Bear in mind, Gen 6 introduced only 72 new Pokemon, not counting Mega Evolutions. So for 51% of them to be Fairy type is maybe a bit overkill. It's like if McDonald's started selling tacos out of nowhere and then suddenly it took up more than half the menu. It would be a little obnoxious. But before we go overboard covering all the new fairies introduced in Gen 6, first we have to look at the attributes of the fairy type. Obviously, one of the biggest factors behind fairy's success is how superbly defensive it is, only being weak to steel and poison, which are two relatively uncommon offensive types due to their lack of coverage. I mean really, poison coverage moves are among the least common in the game because the only type they beat besides fairy is grass. And why waste a slot in a poison move when Ice Beam also beats grass plus like hundreds of other relevant Pokemon? Fairy also boasts the all-important resistance to fighting that we mentioned earlier, and a pretty underrated resistance to dark I might add. With Steel losing its resistance to Dark in Gen 6, Dark started to become a much more viable offensive type, for the same reason that Dragon was for all those years. Hardly anything resisted it. Nothing but Dark itself, Fighting, and Fairy. Fairy also resists Bug, which isn't super relevant, but it does feel like Game Freak just gave Bug a really unnecessary middle finger with that one. But it does make them resist the incredibly common move of U-turn, which is a nice bonus. Anyway, perhaps the most notable Gen 6 fairy types are the ones who aren't from Gen 6 at all. Most of the top tier ones were Pokemon who were previously very underwhelming and only reached the pinnacle of competition after having their type changed, which just shows how good fairy types matchup spread really is. As a result, Pokemon like Azumarill, Gardevoir, and Clefable all skyrocketed in popularity, who were able to use their new superb defensive typing to great effect. In VGC's first year with Fairy existing, Seijin Park was able to pilot Gardevoir without the Mega to a Worlds title in 2014, as it proved to be an effective counter for some of the remaining Dragon types who were still popular in the format like Garchomp and Hydreigon. Though, ironically, Seijin did also use a Garchomp himself. I know, these two important parts of his team are often overshadowed by a particular squirrel. As for new fairy types who made a splash in the meta, two of them are arguably some of the most broken Pokemon in the entire generation, Xerneas and Mega Mawile. Their typing was really just the icing on the cake though. You could give a Bug Ice-type Huge Power or Geomancy and it would probably do almost as well. Still, it can't be understated how immediately influential fairy-type Pokemon were on the meta. And it certainly seemed that as Game Freak had slain one monster of a type, they had unintentionally created another. Obviously, once restricted legendaries became legalized, Xerneas would go on to be one of the most dominant and loathed fairy-type Pokemon of all time. Though, rather surprisingly, it never took home the crown in the World Championships. Not that it really matters, because in Generation 7, fairies would find a way to the top with or without Xerneas. Gen 7 would introduce 13 new fairy-type Pokemon, and despite that being a considerable drop from Gen 6, almost all of them would be good in some way or another. Alolan Ninetales is often considered the best snow-setting Pokemon in the series. Mimikyu is a built-in substitute that allows it to set up and deal crazy damage. Primarina has ascended up the ladder to arguably become a top 3 strongest starter Pokemon ever with its amazing move pool and type combination. And in singles, Magearna is one of the most potent special sweepers to ever exist. Not to mention, being a steel type makes it an excellent counter for, well, other Magearnas. But across both formats, certainly the most influential new Pokemon were the Tapus. Well, not you, Tapu Bulu. The other three. Still, with so many top-tier fairy-type Pokemon flooding the meta all at once, it definitely made this type feel inescapable, regardless of whether you played singles or VGC. This is arguably where the fairy type peaked, and it was certainly the strongest type in the game for this generation. Although Generation 8 would introduce significantly fewer viable fairy types, the ones that did make it to the top were more than enough. Zacian would obviously become one of the most broken Pokemon of its time, and while its immense stats and ridiculous ability may have had something to do with that, it didn't hurt that it was a combination of the two best types in the game. Grimmsnarl also became one of the biggest defensive beasts in VGC history, as Prankster allows it to set up screens before it even takes a hit, and its combination of Dark and Fairy makes it all the more tricky to deal with. Hatterene was another notable addition in this generation, as it could set up Calm Minds to sweep while also keeping opponents at bay with its amazing ability Magic Bounce. And now we finally arrive at Generation 9, where despite new incredible threats existing like Fluttermane, Iron Valiant, and Screamtail, it seems as though Fairy has taken a slight step down from its position of dominance in past generations. With the advent of terrestrialization, many Pokemon, especially in VGC, will terrestrialize to maximize their defensive presence rather than their offensive presence. And what type is the best at being defensive? That's right, little boy, Steel types. 10 points to Gryffindor. Steel was already emerging as the best type in the game towards the end of Gen 8, but now that any Pokemon can become a Steel type, we're really seeing just how valuable it is. And with the record numbers of steel types that we're seeing in the meta currently, this has also led to an increased number of fire types to fight back against them. And as it so happens, fire and steel are the two most important types when it comes to resisting fairy. Sorry, poison types, I know you resist fairy too, but you guys will probably never be that good. Add on top the previously meta-defining threats like Xerneas and Zacian have substantially fallen off, and you have a metagame that is much less influenced by fairy than in years past. However, with that being said, there's still more than enough fairy-type threats to go around. Once again, need I remind you of Fluttermane?
Hello,
Not nearly
Pozo.
as cute and cuddly as the fairy types of Gen 6 and 7, huh? And while Fairy has faced tons of competition from Terra Steel Pokemon, Fairy itself has also proven to be a popular Terra type. The most broken Pokemon currently in the game, Calyrex Shadow Rider, has been known to frequently terrestrialize into a Fairy type to avoid its big weaknesses to Dark and Ghost, and boost the damage of its lone recovery move, Draining Kiss. And other popular singles Pokemon like Kingambit and Skeledirge can also take advantage of Fairy's amazing defensive capabilities to boost their survivability. So Terra giveth and Terra taketh away. So what have we learned through this history lesson? Well, obviously, fairy types were a needed addition to the game, regardless of what many dragon-type truthers will tell you. It has clearly maintained a presence as one of the game's best defensive types and a great counter for many popular offensive Pokemon. But at the same time, I feel like fairy types are slightly overrated by their haters. To this day, I see people online claiming that Fairy has been the best type since 2013 and that the type is still crazily broken. And while that does apply to a select few Pokemon throughout history, such as Xerneas or Fluttermane, Fairy type really hasn't been the best since Gen 7. Nowadays, Fairy is arguably the 4th or maybe even the 5th best type in the game. It's definitely not as good as Steel, Fire, or Water, and with types like Ghost and Ground rapidly improving, they could drop even further. However, the likelihood of Fairy ever being worse than a top 5 type seems very unlikely to me. Fairy types are simply too versatile to ever fall that low. It's a great type that I think has solidly fit itself into the complex game that is Pokemon. So what do you think about fairy type Pokemon? Have you grown to appreciate them like so many others, or are you stuck in 2013? Let me know in the comment section down below. But don't forget to leave a like on this video if you enjoyed, subscribe for more videos just like this one, and I'll see you guys next time.